Chelsea King was a beautiful Poway teen who disappeared while on a trail run and was later found murdered. Her convicted killer was a violent sex offender out on parole, and the tragedy highlighted a very serious and obvious gap in public safety. But this week marks landmark legislation that helped fix that, the 5th anniversary of Chelsea's Law. And here with us to talk about it, we have some very special guests here today. Brent King, Chelsea's father, thank you so much for joining us, and former California Assemblyman Nathan Fletcher, thanks for coming.
Absolutely.
Okay, so Mr. Fletcher, it seems like it would be sort of a no-brainer that a violent sex offender who's hurt children before would not be out on parole, but you actually had some challenges getting this through, right?
Well, no, we had huge challenges. Brent and I were just talking this week at the Remembrance when we started that. What we were trying to do had failed so many times in California, so many times around the country. We had a major budget deficit. We had a legislature that time and again had rejected this. And too often in politics, you don't see big, bold ideas. Either nothing gets done or it gets whittled down to absolutely nothing. And we did something big. We did a true one-strike life without the possibility of parole. We fundamentally reworked the entire parole system in terms of how it works. We put in place dynamic risk assessment, and we paid for it all. But at the outset of that, as we look back now, we go, of course it was a no-brainer. But at the time, that bill really was in a precarious position.
And Mr. King, I remember when NBC7's Artie Ojeda sat down with you the day that was signed, you said you wanted Chelsea's life, her memory, and her legacy to go on with something more than that sad ending. And do you feel like this bill has done that? And what else has it done to help in the healing process?
What you want to make sure of as a parent, first off, is that your daughter's memory is thought of in very powerful light. That's number one. Number two, you don't want a piece of legislation named after her that isn't effective. So we're incredibly pleased at how effective this law is working right now.
Okay. Well, Mr. Fletcher, 5 years ago, the state was facing a major budget crisis. And I remember there's some news stories coming out at the time about how much it was costing to keep three strikers in prison and pay for their lifelong health care and their end of life. How did you guys find the funding for this, and is it still being funded?
So it is. So three things we said we were going to do is we were going to do something big and bold. The second thing is we said we were going to pay for it. And then the third was make sure it was implemented. So the way we paid for it was actually interesting. So in the first 5 months of that bill, every day I would say, how are you going to pay for it? How are you going to pay for it? I said, well, we will. And then when we found a way, it didn't get nearly as much attention, but what we did was actually find penalties that were too high, primarily drug offenses. First-time drug offenders that were being charged as felons and put in the state system. I believe that's inconsistent with justice, and we lowered those penalties to get them in county treatment facilities, and we took the cost savings from that to pay for the people, violent sex offenders, who absolutely should be in prison and should stay. And so it was a novel approach, and now you see a lot of talk about lowering penalties on drug offenses. Well, we did that 5 years ago in Chelsea's Law in order to pay for it. And then the second thing is on the implementation is we had to fight a few times after it passed to make sure the programs got started, that they got properly funded. But every year the foundation produces a report where we track the effectiveness, we look at the convictions, we make sure it's implemented and monitored, and that was something else we committed to, because new laws are pointless if the ones aren't being enforced and implemented. And I think for me, a personal point of pride is through the foundation and others, we've continued to do that year in and year out to make sure kids are safe.
Mr. King, successful bill, do you think? I think I saw a statistic that the 39% reduction in violent sex crimes against children. Do you feel it's worked?
Two pieces. First, I think it's a very successful piece of legislation. It's doing exactly what we set out to do, which is taking the absolute worst of the worst off the streets for a longer period of time or up to life. The second thing it does, it creates awareness, and it allows us to then move forward and make the laws even tougher if we need to, or strengthen them or weaken them as needed. So it brings a lot of awareness.
Do you want to tell us what other work Chelsea's Light Foundation continues to do?
Oh, sure. Obviously, we are working in other states trying to pass the exact same style law. It's scary that where we live now in Illinois, the law looks just like it did in California 6 years ago. That's true of almost every other state in the country. So we're working in a lot of states trying to get the same legislation passed. Second off, we provide scholarships to kids. Right now we have 41 kids under scholarship, just over $300,000 that we've awarded out. All the monies from our race go back into the scholarships for San Diego County kids. So we're thrilled with that. And we're launching a Changemaker League inside of the school systems in the next coming months that we're really thrilled about. So.
Mr. Fletcher,
Yeah.
I noticed on your Huffington Post article that you had this week, you were mentioning you're urging people to sign a bill, a federal
Right.
bill. Is it the same, or what is it?
No, it's a federal bill that's going to do a lot of things to raise awareness, to continue to drive the conversation and discussion, and ultimately to have true success, we're going to have to go state by state because states have primary jurisdictions for these crimes. But this federal legislation we think is a great step in the right direction that will continue to raise awareness and highlight the problems. And so we're hoping to do that while we continue to work through all the states.
And then I don't know if we talked about this yet or not. We should have, though. Is it's not just the one-time life in prison for these violent crimes. It does a lot of other things. Can you tell me what those other things are?
Well, so we started with we wanted to focus on people we were afraid of, not mad at, and a lot of sex offender bills that have been overly broad. But that category, folks, the worst of the worst are the true one-strike life without the possibility of parole. But below that, constitutionally, you have a level of folks you can't charge with that. And so we had a series of 47 different penalty increases where we increased penalties to give prosecutors and DAs more discretion as they're working on agreements. We also created the charge of lifetime parole. So for those worst offenders who are going to get out, we can track you for the rest of your life. We put in place restrictions on sex offenders visiting parks and public places. And then we fundamentally rebuilt the entire system of what happens when someone gets out. A dynamic risk assessment model where law enforcement can monitor your compliance and raise your score or lower your score to give more resources or less resources. We put in place polygraphing of sex offenders so that we can polygraph. I can't send you back to prison because of a polygraph, but we can increase your score so you have a probation officer literally living on top of you. I mean, it was a complete transformative overhaul of the entire system, and something that I think all San Diegans should be really proud of. Yeah.
Mr. King, finally, just wanted to talk to you about, some are grandfathered in, though, before this, right? And so you see these communities, and it's often underserved communities, to be frank, where they're going to go ahead and release these sex predators into them, and just kind of the outrage and the emotion that you see from these parents. Yep. What do you feel about that? What do you want done about it?
Great question. A lot of those parents actually reach out to us and ask us, what can we do? The answer, it's a sad answer. The answer is good news. Since Chelsea's law, it's improving. So I know in time this is not going to happen. But I know right now it's an issue that is there. I would fight it tooth and nail if I was one of the neighbors. That is not going to happen in my backyard.
Mr. King, thank you so much for joining us and offering this perspective. And Mr. Fletcher, thank you for coming on Political Zoom. We appreciate it very much.